Hi guys, welcome to our daily encounter. Psalm 16 and verse 11 says, "In your presence is fullness of joy. In your presence is fullness of joy." And those who have walked with the awareness of God's presence, who have lived with their hearts linked in love to God, and have walked this life with God continually on their mind and in their heart, and just having that sense of His uh, immediacy and closeness, know what the psalmist is talking about here. Truly, in the presence of the Lord is fullness of joy, not just happiness, but fullness of joy, overflowing joy, we could say. And the psalmist recognizes this, and those who have walked with the Lord will recognize this as well. But how did the psalmist get to this point? How is it that the psalmist walked in the presence of the Lord? How is it that the psalmist kept his mind continually linked to God with this awareness? Well, he makes some key statements in Psalm 16 that I think give us a hint as to how the psalmist abided or resided in the presence of God and enjoyed the fullness of joy that came from it. For one, he said in verse 2, it says, "I have no good besides you." The first step in walking with the awareness of God's presence, enjoying the fullness of joy that comes from walking linked to God in this way, is recognizing that we have no good besides Him. And what this does is it brings to the surface a deep, abiding desire for God. When we look around the world and we see it for what it truly is, that it really can't truly satisfy, even at its best. It just really can't give us and offer us what we truly need, what our soul is really longing for. And when we can recognize that and we see that, it causes us to long for God. When we think that satisfaction comes from the things of this world, of temporary pleasures and comforts and all these amenities and things that we acquire, then our hearts become distracted and turned away from the Lord. But when we recognize that He is the sole good, He is the one that is the only one who can really offer me what I truly need. When we see that we have no good besides Him, we've taken our first step to abiding in the presence of God. But then he goes on to say in verse 5, "The Lord is the portion of my inheritance and my cup. You support my lot. The lines have fallen to me in pleasant places. Indeed, my heritage is beautiful to me." There the psalmist sees God as his inheritance. And maybe inheritance doesn't mean much to us today, other than perhaps a rich uncle leaving us a bunch of stuff. Back then, the inheritance was a huge thing for the Jews back then. Their inheritance, their plot of land that was given to them divinely through God's own portioning out the land, that was a very big deal. And God saw it as a very big deal. He went through a lot of, or gave a lot of commandments to safeguard each person's inheritance. But here, the psalmist is saying, God is my inheritance, not some plot of land ultimately, but God is my inheritance. And when we recognize that God is our inheritance, we know that the lines have fallen in pleasant places. God is our inheritance, and the lines, that is, we could say the property lines, fall in pleasant places. He's borrowing off of this idea that if you were to inherit a piece of land, where the property lines would fall, he would see that where his property lines have fallen is in pleasant places. A person might have their property line fall in some unpleasant places, maybe in a place that's dry and dusty, or that's grown over and rough and rocky and that kind of thing. But here he sees his lines have fallen in pleasant places, and the pleasant places in which his lines have fallen is God Himself. And you can't get more pleasant than that. And so this was the second thing that he recognized. Not only did he not have any good besides God, but he saw how good God actually was, how pleasant it was to abide in God, how pleasant it was to have God as one's inheritance. And then we see that he sets his mind on God. As we continue on, he says in verse 8, I have set the Lord continually before me. And this is extremely important when we talk about walking with the awareness of God's presence and the abundance of joy that comes out of that. It takes a continuation of attention to God in order for us to really walk with an abiding and sense of God's presence. Here he says, I have set the Lord continually before me. And I like how the Living Bible renders this. In verse 8, it says, I am always thinking of the Lord. And that's the idea. Setting the Lord before his face continually is the same as always thinking of the Lord. And that's what we should do if we're really seeking the awareness of God's presence at all times, is just keep our minds focused on him. This could be done through reading scripture, maybe not sitting down for 3 hours and reading scriptures, but maybe every so often picking up a verse, reading it, maybe taking a section of scriptures and reading them here and there. It can also be from worshiping the Lord, singing songs to God, either verbally or at least in our minds. It can be lifting up prayers to God and praying to him continually and just having an open conversation with the Lord in that way. But whatever we can do to keep our mind fixed on God, to continually be thinking about God, that's a way in which we can abide in the presence of God and enjoy the fullness of joy that comes. And then in verse 11, that's when he brings in this, in your presence is fullness of joy. And he came to that conclusion, and he was able to enjoy that because he had recognized that there was no good besides God. The Lord was his inheritance, and it was a great and beautiful and pleasant inheritance. And he was continually thinking about God by setting God before his face continually. And he got to reap the benefits of that by having this joy, this fullness of joy that came from God's presence. And we can have that too. This isn't something unique to the psalmist of David here. It's not unique to some spiritual guru somewhere. Each and every person who has a relationship with God can practice this and enjoy this each and every day, every moment, every hour. We can enjoy the presence of God and the fullness of joy that comes from it. And this psalm can help us, guide us into that process. So these are some things we can reflect on and think about as we do our reading today. With that, guys, I do thank you for watching the video today. Hope you guys have a great day. Love you guys. God bless.